Well, welcome everyone to today's On the Front Porch event discussing this book, Government Project. My name is Brent Orrell, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, where I lead our vocation, career, and work team looking at ways government policy can assist all Americans, and especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, to gain the education, training, and supportive services they need to succeed in the workforce. For those of you who are unfamiliar with AEI, we are a nonprofit public policy research institution dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The work of our scholars and staff advance ideas rooted in our belief in democracy, free enterprise, American strength and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of our society, and a pluralistic entrepreneurial culture. Contemporary differences between rural and urban America have their roots in long-term demographic, economic, technological, and social factors. Today's event is one in a series co-hosted by AEI and the Brookings Institution that we call On the Front Porch. We seek to focus attention on the challenges and opportunities facing rural America and how federal policy might be used to promote economic and social development and opportunity outside the nation's major metropolitan areas. Thus far in the series, we have looked at a number of different questions relating to the sources of continuing strength, as well as the challenges facing rural America. We've looked at voting patterns, social attitudes, economic disparities, and most recently, the opioid crisis. All of these conversations are available through the AEI and Brookings websites if you would like to catch up on the Front Porch. Today, we're going to look back in history, almost 90 years, at the results of a New Deal project, the Farm Services Administration's Casa Grande Valley Farms in Pinal County, Arizona, today part of the Phoenix, Mesa, Chandler metro area. This experiment is a very early example of federally sponsored and directed place-based economic development. Casa Grande was reviewed by Edward C. Banfield in the book that you have on the tables, Government Project, and it was published first in 1951. As we'll hear from our guest, AEI Senior Fellow Kevin Kosar, Banfield's book tells of how Casa Grande, an agricultural cooperative that sought to boost employment, income, and economic self-sufficiency among impoverished residents of Arizona and other Southwest states, Casa Grande, despite its best intentions, struggled from its inception, was eventually shut down when the nation emerged from the Great Depression during World War II. Our main question today is whether and how and if Banfield's insights ought to inform our thinking about federal rural economic development programs, especially those, as I said, focused on rural and non-metropolitan areas. This is an important question, especially in light of the large new investments being made through the bipartisan CHIPS and Science and Infrastructure Acts and other recent federal legislation. As I mentioned, Kevin is our featured guest here. He is a PhD and a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the U.S. Congress, congressional oversight, the administrative state, American politics, and the U.S. Postal Service. He edits understandingcongress.org and hosts the Understanding Congress podcast. He co-founded the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, which aims to strengthen Congress, and established legbranch.org, an online hub for congressional reform and scholarship. His writings appear in a wide range of academic and news outlets. He holds a BA from The Ohio State University and an MA and a PhD from The New York University. I'm also very pleased to welcome again my friend and colleague Tony Pipa as my co-pilot for this conversation. Tony is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. Tony launched and leads the Reimagining Federal Rural Policy Initiative, which seeks to modernize and transform U.S. federal policy to enable community and economic development in underserved rural places across the U.S. He also hosts the Reimagine Rural podcast, which is excellent. I highly recommend it, which profiles rural towns across America that are making progress on their efforts to thrive amid social and economic change. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our friends from C-SPAN who are covering our event today, and let viewers know that we'll be taking questions from both our in-person and virtual audiences. If you are watching on our live stream, our AEI live stream, or on our AEI live stream, you can submit questions by email to hunter.dixon@aei.org or on X or Twitter, depending on your preferences, at #OnTheFrontPorch. So, with all that said, let's get started. Kevin, why did you decide to republish a book written in 1951 about a project from 1938?
Book royalties, of course. No, no, most certainly not. It's an excellent book, and it's a shame that the book is out of print because it's just so full of wisdom. It also tells the story of a part of New Deal history that is fading from memory. There's just not too many other things out there written about Casa Grande. You can go into the Library of Congress's photograph collection and you can look at some of the photos there, but as far as telling the story of this place, what it was dreamt to be, how it was rolled out, and how it crashed on the shoals, nobody had done that. And it's also an important book because for those of us who are in Washington, D.C., or quite frankly, anybody who's working in policy anywhere, it teaches you the lesson of humility, that making policy and having it work out is a very fraught exercise, and one that can go wrong in so many ways, often unexpected. And so this case study, which is written, it's written like journalism. Ed Banfield was trained in journalism, is told as a story, yet along the way, you can just learn so much from it. So yeah, I wanted to bring the book back because I think it's wonderful.
Tell us a little bit about Banfield. Who was he?
Yeah, he was a fellow born in 1916 in Connecticut. He went to college first to study animal husbandry, and then he decided that he really didn't want to work with animals and make money from dealing with them. And so he swapped over to journalism without a clear idea of what would come next. He then went from college to work for the New Deal. He worked first for the Timber Salvage Administration as a person who was writing press releases and trying to educate the media on all the good work that the Timber Salvage Administration was doing. And then he headed over to the Farm Security Administration, which is where he ultimately encountered this project. After that, it was off to graduate school at the University of Chicago, where he studied deeply from a whole range of areas, sociology and risk analysis and political theory and political science, all sorts of stuff. And after that, he was an academic skyrocket. He ended up at Harvard, and he wrote many books on urban areas. But all that sort of thinking about urban areas and the trouble of urban areas, which were such a big deal in the 1960s, ultimately came out of this book. They stemmed from the basic question of how do you get people to cooperate for the greater good.
So in thinking about the book, what do you think Banfield's key insights were about Casa Grande? Maybe you should describe Casa Grande a little bit, and then what were his key insights?
Sure. So it was a patch of not easy to farm land. The government acquired a few thousand acres of it and tried to create a successful farm there. I mean, this was Great Depression. This was a time where small farmers were going bankrupt left and right and being forced to migrate or just go hungry. And it was an experiment out there. Initially, the US government thought, well, why don't we just give each person that we choose to participate in this program, who wants to participate, 40 acres of land, and they could set up their own farm. But then they quickly realized that these farms didn't have a chance at surviving. The nature of the economy, the rolling out of the diesel tractor, as happens in so many sectors under a capitalist economy, you get bigger and bigger firms, and they do things more efficiently. So that was not a workable plan. So they, on the fly, swapped over to this idea of creating a cooperative farm. Cooperatives were a pretty hot idea a century ago. We still have cooperatives today. I actually live in a cooperative apartment building up in Northwest DC. You see cooperatives in a variety of areas of life, agricultural cooperatives and such. But this was an attempt to apply the cooperative model to a farm. And what that means is they kind of married the idea of a corporation with a democracy. So anybody invited to be a member of the farm was going to be a shareholder in the enterprise as a whole, and therefore have the right to vote on who gets to be on the board, and that the board would have the authority to choose the kind of day-to-day manager of the enterprise. So it was a very progressive idea at the time, what they were trying to unleash at Casa Grande, a mixture of economic security, but also self-governance.
So do people actually own the land, or was it sort of lent, leased, whatever to them?
It was a very peculiar thing because it was government-owned land, but then they incorporated under Arizona laws this cooperative entity, which then had ownership of the land. And so yes, the people living there got a share, and also by virtue of their time in there, also built their equity in ownership of the place.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Tony in a minute, but I would like you to just give us the highlights. What happened?
Well, the farm lasted only 7 years. Initially, it got its legs under itself and was, roughly covering its operating costs. It was selling enough alfalfa and raising enough cows and pigs and things like that that they could do all right. Unfortunately, the people who were on the farm, which was 60 to 70 families in all, fell into fighting with one another. You had factions develop who were struggling for control of the place. You had other people who just didn't want to participate at all in the politics and wanted to be left alone. You had lots of internal strife, and eventually the people on the farm, a faction of them, decided that we're just going to liquidate this place. And so, as one farm member said, kind of shaking his head afterwards, we killed the damn goose that laid the golden egg, because this was a place where these individuals who had been recruited to live there had a better material condition than they probably ever had. They had brand new homes, freshly paved streets, new community center, steady pay. It was a very exceptional way to live during the Great Depression.
Electricity, all the
Electricity,
amenities.
flush toilets.
Yeah, okay. All right, Tony, your turn. What do you want to ask about this?
So one of the questions I'd start with, so there's a cooperative model, and to the way you just described it, it was sort of a mix of, capitalism but democracy, and they fell into factions. But the way I read the book is that it really never was truly a cooperative model. I mean, it was very top-down from the very beginning. Even if there were voting shares, it was the government that installed the person who was effectively running the cooperative, and he had a lot of rules and tried to enforce a lot of ways of saying this is the way things ought to be done. So I guess one question I'd have is, was it really the model, or was it the implementation that never even actually sort of lived up to what the model promised?
Yeah, I would suggest it's both. You're quite right. The FSA, this was a project that they created without congressional support. It wasn't as if there were some senators back in DC who had put a line item in the spending bill and said, do this. This was FDR's team just creating something on. So they didn't have a lot of support for it, and they were quite anxious that, we're not sure, they didn't think the people who settled the farm were actually competent to run it. They were hoping that they would one day be competent, but they didn't think that they were competent. And so on the one hand, they were telling them you're part of a cooperative, and the founding legal documents said your shareholders get to vote. On the other hand, the FSA, as you know, was running it in a very heavy-handed way. Now, whether the model could have ever worked, I'm dubious, because the cooperatives I'm familiar with are not totalizing of human life. These people, their work, their residents, their entire community was all bound up in the success of that cooperative. That's very different from my apartment building. I work here, I earn my living here, and yes, I can go participate in elections at the cooperative there, but the stakes are, it's about the financial health of the apartment building itself, which is very different from, gosh, you and I are in the same community and we're fighting over something, like if you get your way, maybe my paycheck gets cut, or maybe my job gets eliminated, or maybe my conditions of work get changed in some sort of way. I think the cooperative model was, as rolled out at Casa Grande, was just, it put people into an all-encompassing situation where they were just consumed by it.
Well, the other part of it, though, is that it was also a resettlement project, correct? So the people who were living in Casa Grande were not necessarily from that place. Like, it wasn't that they had generations there. They sort of understood that place. I'm not even sure how many of them knew how to farm or like had that experience. So while we might term it like as a place-based policy, it was actually almost like creating a place from scratch rather than investing in people who were in that place to begin with. So I could see on one hand the government's, impulse to say, well, wait a second, we got to make sure there's some guidelines here. We're going to tell you what to do. But on the other hand, like, that would be very different than a policy today, where we would be investing in a local government, let's say, that's kind of run by people who are elected from that particular place, even if even the extent to which they might be volunteers or not even have much capacity. And so I find that also very interesting. It was like we were trying to create something out of whole cloth that didn't really exist before. And I think that seems to have something to do with it as well.
Yeah, as you two would know better than I the importance of social capital, that collectively held knowledge, plus the bonds of trust that enable people to work with one another, that was just wholly lacking. And I'm not sure that it was entirely clear to the people who planned this community that it's a big deal. Mm-hmm. That if you want these people to cooperate and to share the wealth and to come to agreements about who gets to do what job, some jobs are harder than others. Picking cotton versus being the guy riding around in the pickup truck supervising, I know which one I pick. If you don't have trust, then those decisions are going to become a scrum. And they're going to be very difficult to make. And that's exactly what happened.
It does imply a certain understanding of human anthropology. Like, either people are naturally sort of able to come together without previous connection and build something together. I think that's what the kind of the anthropology of the founders was. Like, we can engineer this community, we can create it, and that seems to me to set up. That seems to me the basis of it not working. Aside from cotton in Arizona must be a really dicey proposition. Even in 1938, it's hot. There was a lot of discussion in the book about crop failures and all sorts of pressures on the community. But but that seems to me to be the original problem, is believing that the federal government could create, as Tony said, out of whole cloth, a community that would cooperate and function well together, even though people were drawn from disparate places, brought in, set up, and like, go do this. That seems to me to be it's a kind of hubris that's actually, I think, difficult to find these days. We don't really, that fell out of fashion so long ago that it's hard to imagine. So all that leads up to my question, which is like, when you put your project together on this and wrote your introduction, what if anything can we learn today that would be useful today out of that project, given how different the social, political, economic, cultural context is? Are there things that we can extract out of this that ought to inform CHIPS and Science, or the Infrastructure Act programs, or Recompete, or any of the other major employment kinds of programs that really are just getting started out of a lot of legislation that's been passed in the last few years?
Yeah, I would say first, when it comes to the planning process, it's important to remember that in our society, planning does not occur in a vacuum. It's always within the context of politics. So you may be in the executive branch, but don't be surprised if you have people in the legislative branch who are saying, hey, by the way, we're the ones who have oversight over you, we're the appropriators, and we have views on this. Moreover, the people in charge of the executive branch have to think about re-election and what you're doing, and they may also impinge upon your freedom to do what you see as the most highly rational thing. It's also important to know that planning inherently requires a lot of human beings to have a shared vision for what needs to be done. And I've spent time in a bureaucracy, a government bureaucracy. I've been in private sector bureaucracies, and you can never assume people know and are in agreement. There's often confusion, even if people are all of goodwill and want to get along. But even that is not usually the case. There are always those who have different desires and wishes, whether they want to climb the ladder or aggrandize themselves or stick it to somebody else. Human beings are not just cogs in a machine. And knowing the beneficiaries. This was a big theme for Banfield, is that the people who came to Casa Grande were desperate. These were not people who had a ideal that they were pursuing. They didn't say, we're going to be on this kibbutz, or we're going to join this 60s commune because we have a shared belief, or anything like that. They were desperate people who, many of them just wanted ultimately, after they put food in their bellies and roofs over their heads and had some stability in their lives, to create their own farms. So what they ultimately wanted over the long run, their idea of the good life, just didn't match what the planners thought. And the planners back in Washington were shocked at this. Why would you shut down this farm where you've had it better than you've ever had? That's irrational. That doesn't make sense on paper. But to the people there who didn't find true happiness, it didn't work for them.
I think what's interesting is that as a resettlement project, people were coming from all over to come to this one place. And we're kind of flipping that on its head almost with the policies coming out of the legislation that Brent mentioned. Because we're not seeing people, actually, we went through a long time in our history where people moved to opportunity. They left their place to go where they thought the jobs were and where they thought more opportunity was. And we've seen a real slowdown in that. And people staying in places where they might not think, where there might not be economic opportunity, but staying for potentially many different reasons. And so we're looking to bring opportunity to those places where people do have some kinship, they do have some bonds, and they do have some idea of what they think the solutions might be to their places. And so it's interesting to think about this from the perspective of how do we provide investment into those places in a way that whatever trust there might be because of longstanding social capital or human bonds, or even a kinship to a place's history and a person's place in that, that we actually leverage that trust rather than undermine that trust. But investment creates a disruption, better or for worse, right? Like both,
yeah,
right?
You're
right.
going to get positive and negative externalities to the policy.
I mean, when I went out and visited Central Ohio, where large investment through the CHIPS and Science Act is helping Intel put a couple major fabrication plants. It's creating jobs. It's definitely creating construction jobs that are happening right now. Presumably over the long term, it will create permanent jobs at those fabrication plants, which will create pathways for people who might be in high school now, for example, or middle school into those jobs. But it also creates disruption in the places surrounding that as well. Infrastructure needs, water needs, a whole lot of other needs. And how we decide and who gets to decide and who's part of those decisions, I think is a really big part of how important, how successful we'll be with the implementation of those particular kinds of investments. And I wonder what we can learn from this to be thinking to ourselves, okay, how do we do this in a way that decision-making does seem to leverage trust rather than undermine trust with investment?
In the case of the Ohio plan, it seems like it did both, right?
Yeah,
like
I think
it leveraged, everybody got excited. This is a great opportunity for our community. Let's go all in, and that required this trust between within the community and between the community and
different levels of governance.
And the company and companies, I should say. There's more than one company that's operating here, and then things go wrong in that trust cycle, where deliberately or accidentally, miscommunication, whatever it is, it gets disrupted. The trust gets disrupted in the community, and then you've got a whole bunch of challenges as a result of that. So,
and some of those are planning challenges, right? What is this place going to look like over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years? We're going to see growth. Who gets to manage that growth? How do we plan? What does that shared vision look like? Back to your shared vision, planning is about a shared vision. How do we create planning models that are equitable and take that into account? Like who gets to be part of that planning, I guess is part of the question. And how does that planning be cooperative and build trust rather than it seem to be unequal, and some will benefit and some will lose?
It's interesting you should mention Ohio and that intervention. And then some years ago, not too far from there was the investment in Lordstown and trying to revive the auto industry there. And as an Ohioan and as a guy who's not too far from Lordstown, you drive through there and it's just painful because the expectations of the intervention just inflated people's beliefs and hopes at the possibility of reviving the manufacturing sector and the jobs that came with it, and maybe the whole community itself could kind of get back on its feet. And then that hope's dashed. And now I think, gosh, if you try to go back there and say, no, we're from Washington, I promise you, we've got it right this time. How much buy-in are you going to get? I mean, it's a very fraught thing. And the whole question of getting everybody on the same page is just so tough. I mean, if we say, hey, we're going to do this intervention, we're going to create jobs here, we're going to lift all boats in various ways, like what you mean by that versus what a person understands that to mean can be very different things. The timelines could be different. I mean, so much, it's just the shared understanding of what is going on and what we're going towards and how this is going to be better for me.
And even in the Ohio example, this is another continuity, I think. I wouldn't call it capture, but I would call it like some people are just better positioned to take immediate advantage. That was the challenge in Ohio, was like people was it on the commission who sold property, that approved the project, who sold property to the company? I can't remember exactly.
There's a development company that put the property together.
Right.
And then
But somebody on the one of the units of local government sold some of, it was the trustees.
Township trustee.
A trustee sold land to the developer and immediately that immediately rang bells in the community, like, is there self-dealing going on here? Whether it was or not, I have no idea. I'm just saying that's similar to the dynamic in Casa Grande, which was all the animals are equal, but some of the animals are more equal than others. And am I getting my fair share? And is there, does somebody have more power than I do? Factionalism that develops as people chase the resource.
Yeah, and I think for planners, it's particularly tough because of the old iron law of oligarchy. When you take a society, inevitably there's going to be small slivers of the population who are interested in public affairs and have the time and energy to partake of them. And you, the planner, are trying to get a read on the people there, and guess who's going to be in your ear the most? I mean, it's the same problem that legislators in this town have a problem with, is that they're trying to get a read on where their constituents are, but who do they hear most from? Lobbyists, interest groups, people who make politics their profession. And so I think that's another thing that we saw at Casa Grande, is that there were a lot of people there who just didn't want anything to do with the power struggles. They were okay with the FSA. They weren't sure they wanted to stay there for the long term, but it was better than the alternatives. They were just kind of riding it out to see if this weird thing that they were doing was going to work out. And then you had these factions that were supercharged and supposedly speaking for the communities who were at each other's throat. And that's going to happen whenever you get involved in planning, because guess who's going to show up to those community meetings? Mm-hmm. It's the folks who call into C-SPAN, the people who care.
Well, it is interesting that, and I do think that this is a struggle at all levels of governance, actually, when it comes to planning, when it comes to, what's our community going to look like over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Where do we want to go? And it sort of falls into that big rubric of community engagement. How do we make sure we're hearing from as many people as possible in the community? And who actually has a strong voice in that? Like, who's really at that table? And I think we're experimenting with a lot of models, not all of them government sponsored. I mean, I think a lot of that is community led as well. But I think that is actually a real dynamic in rural communities around, and we've even had, past conversation, we were talking about the injustice of place and kind of elite capture that happens in a lot of rural communities, that a lot of rural economies are extractive economies. And so a lot of it depends on investment coming in from the outside, takes that value. Some people really, really benefit who are local because they're kind of the brokers to the outside interests. But when those outside interests leave, many of the larger populace that was employed or that was part of those enterprises really have no resilience, have nothing else to stand on. And how do we, think about models in which the benefits are shared more widely, but people also have some voice in what's happening there when we do our planning and bring in investment from the outside? Because for many rural places, investment is going to, whether it's public or private,
Sure.
Much of that investment will come from the outside sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that economic development as a kind of means for making people's lives better. It's just so complicated on so many levels, not least of which is you're trying to pick an industry and hope that it works out over a long time. And capitalism is very good at chewing up one thing or another, whether it's a firm or an industry. You know, the investment in chips, yeah, electronics are not going away. We're going to need plenty more chips. Question is, you know, are somebody going to open up a chip factory in Mexico, some other place, and be able to offer better chip at a better price? Does the government then have to enact protectionist measures and do this, that, and the other to kind of keep this going in some sort of way? You kind of look at what happened to the US auto industry. Gosh, it was glorious at one point, but after buying that '76 Buick Regal, I was clear that they had quit paying attention to quality and had been coasting for a time. And then when markets were opened up, it was devastating. That industry took it on the chin in a bad sort of way, because precisely the government quit protecting it. And so, yeah, when you're looking at reviving a community based upon reviving the economy, it's hard to pick, right?
Right, but I mean, even if they pick it, or I'm not suggesting that it gets picked from the outside. I mean, Recompete basically is providing an on-ramp and an investment to local communities for them to determine what they think their assets are and what their human capital and their social capital is and what their best bet is, to be able to do that. But yet, even when doing that, to ensure that as many people as possible, to your point, there's often a hierarchy of who's in the decision-making around that, and how well informed they are to the wider populace of the needs and wants that they have as well.
Yeah, I'm curious. Since the chips thing is a home state thing for me, and it's an ongoing experiment. When they hire, are they anticipating being able to hire all locally or mostly locally, or is there the prospect that they may have to start reaching afield further to have people come into the community in order to be able to staff all the positions they staff? And how's that all working?
The answer is yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's all of those things. And we're working with a team of nonprofits in Columbus to try to support them as they build on-ramps for training and education for people who are currently out of the labor market or are underemployed, right? Trying to use this as an opportunity, you know, like there's this hydraulic effect, right? I mean, there's a really tight labor market in Columbus, in that region of Ohio. It's extremely tight, especially for skilled occupations, you know. They're pulling people from all over the state to staff the jobs that are further up the skill chain. But that creates new openings at the bottom, right? So you can use this as like this hydraulic effect to pull people in, you know. So that's the goal. If you think building a chips plant is hard, wait till you try to build the human capital that goes along with that. I mean, that's especially for disadvantaged populations, just an enormous pull to get people in. And consequently, the administration, you know, they recognized that and they built in a lot of requirements that, you know, you do have to think about disadvantaged populations, people out of the labor force that need to be brought into the labor force. What are you going to do? How are you going to provide the child care? That's taken it's taken a huge rap from a lot of people. They don't like this idea, but you literally can't solve the labor problem unless you have solved the child care problem and transportation and housing. Those are all factors in these grants. So you've got to get in there and figure out how you're going to do all of this. I mean, when I talk about this challenge, I always analogize local or regional labor markets to like a really complicated jigsaw puzzle. And it's not just a jigsaw puzzle. It's a living, breathing jigsaw puzzle where the pieces are changing shape They are changing size. They are changing location. Sometimes they disappear entirely because, like with Lordstown, like a major industry drops out of the local economy and there's nothing to take its place. It's that these things are organic in nature. They're not fixed. And that makes our plans a lot less valuable, right? The plans that we come up with are pretty fragile. They're pretty brittle as they relate to the actual conditions in the community.
Yeah, I feel like we need to make a distinction between plans themselves, like the final products,
Yeah.
and planning processes
Well, that's what Eisenhower said.
and ongoing governance, right?
Plans are useless and planning is essential, right?
Exactly. I mean, and that comes back to me to Casa Grande. Like, it was not organic. Like, there was no real organic process to it. It was we're putting a bunch of people together in this place.
We're here to help. We're going to do it all.
We're going to put a bunch of people in this place, and even though we said you're going to be a cooperative, like, we're going to install somebody at the top that tells you how you all have to act with each other, and then we'll give you some limited ability to say what you can and can't do. And I mean, I think there was factions from the start because there was, that was not even the person that they wanted in place. They would have asked for another person to have been there. And that was sort of a original sin, if you will, I guess, that kind of undermined the whole thing.
Multiple original sins.
Yes, exactly.
Could I tell that little story
Yeah,
about
sure.
that? What happened? So they get the cooperative farms set up, and some of the settlers come on, and the FSA is concerned about getting this up and running. They don't want this to turn into a boondoggle. They're already concerned about people in the press or Capitol Hill decrying this as Sovietism and collectivism. That was a context that they had to manage. So they went ahead and decided they were going to pick this kind of hard-charging, top-down, hierarchical sort of manager guy to run the place. Well, meanwhile, some of these settlers had gotten hold of the incorporation documents and gone out into a barn and read them, and they saw, wait a minute, we're shareholders. We're the ones who are supposed to vote on a board, and the board is supposed to make the decision about that, and this guy is supposed to be accountable to us, and here we've got this guy who's busting our chops, rolling into here, and the government put him here, and that immediately soured things. And then there was another instance where, the people at Casa Grande got paid like $60 a month, and they had free housing, and the FSA at a certain point, due to the revenues not being quite what they should, said, well, what we're going to do is require you to pay $8 a month for your place. So that was just imposed on them. And again, the people got ticked off. Not only did this feel like their wages were being cut, never mind that they were still way better off than when they had prior to Casa Grande, but this felt like a wage cut. It also was, why were we not consulted? Why didn't we get to decide? And the people at the FSA said, look, maybe we'll give you a bonus at the end of the year if this place is highly productive. So they were being both prudent in their management, but also incentivizing the people to work harder. Well, guess what? The people didn't buy it. They didn't trust that these guys who had lied to them twice, taken decisions out of their hands, were somehow going to show up at the end of the year and say, yay, there's extra money, you get it. And so, yeah, very early on, the inability to create trust amongst this aggregation of human beings who were not melded into a community led to bad blood.
And to my mind, that's like not trust in the process, though, as well. Because they were seeing one thing said, that the process was meant to be, and yet to the extent to which they were talking amongst themselves and trying to do some joint decision-making, that wasn't really reflected in anything that was happening in their own lives. And so I think the undermining of trust from the beginning made it really difficult. It made it hard to have that ongoing organic process that you could be resilient with as you were trying to solve problems that cropped up. Because problems are always going to crop up. And to your point, Brent, things are always going to change, right? So your plan is brittle because you're not all-seeing. You don't know exactly what's going to change. What you have to have is a process to be able to go through, to be able to say, okay, how are we going to shift because of that change? And that the trust wasn't there for them to be able to do that.
I have a couple other questions I want to get to, but I want to try to tie this off a little bit. What is is it possible to overcome the knowledge problem that Hayek talked about in relationship to federal investments that are supposed to drive economic development? Is there let me just try this on and tell me what you think, Kevin. I mean, that back in the early 70s, we had this thing called revenue sharing, which was the federal government gives no strings attached money to, I think it was states and localities, or at least localities, that was supposed to, here's your money, here's your seed capital to do whatever it is that you think your community most needs. Is that a better way of organizing this? I mean, if we make the assumption that the federal government is going to spend money and wants to make investments in local communities, would that help to overcome the knowledge problem of it, that all kinds of other federal investments, including discretionary grants in this project, is that a way to go?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that question, and my shorter answer is maybe, but other problems can come with it. And I'm remembering some years ago, I was having a conversation with late Professor Martha Durthick, who was a student of Ed Banfield's and was just a superb scholar of federalism. And I cockily made this argument about, the No Child Left Behind act as a fine thing because these grants and aids that are going down to the state, there's all sorts of accountability provisions, and they have to focus on outcomes and higher test scores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I said, it's much better than the old days when they just put the money on the stump and let the states do what they want. And Martha said, what's wrong with putting money on the stump? And I really didn't have a good answer. And she said, you realize that all that accountability stuff takes money away from the people who need it, creates all sorts of other players. Perverse incentives.
Yeah.
And it costs localities. They have to hire people to fill out all this paperwork and to meet all of these demands. And it just was one of those things that hadn't occurred to me. But yeah, so you can overcome the knowledge problem. But you also open yourself up to then, well, who's deciding at the local level what to do with this money? And is their knowledge truly any better, or are they just going to, use it for purposes other than you would hope? And that's where, that's why we got all that compliance stuff tacked onto the Title I No Child Left Behind Act. Mm-hmm. It started in '65, and they had story after story of money being sent. You're supposed to spend this on helping poor kids. And instead it was like, well, no, this nice high school needs a new football field because we're really proud of the team. And so they spent it on that. They spent it on things other than that. Mm-hmm. And so we live in a world of trade-offs, and that's where it gets tough.
Yeah, and I don't think revenue sharing solves the capture problem. I don't, or the misallocation problem. I think what it does is it moves the decision-making much closer to the population, the people who live in that area, so that when local leaders screw up, buy the wrong thing, invest in the wrong thing, use the money unwisely, they know who to go to. I mean, if a federal grant goes bad, who do you blame?
Right.
It's going to be the federal government that gets the blame. If it's under the control of the local government, at least there's accountability, like direct accountability for the way the money is being spent. So that's my sort of thinking about that.
Yeah, no, I'm very much. I'd like to see more discretion shifted over to the localities and the states. I think there is, as you note, a possibility of improved accountability. I'm a little less confident on how well it solves the knowledge problem. Feds are famous for boondoggles, but these boondoggles are often situated in localities with local input.
A cooperative boondoggle. Yeah, go ahead, Tony, sorry.
Yeah, and a couple of things that I think relate to some of our past conversations and specifically to rural places is, rural places in general, like not everywhere, but in general, are going to be the places that have the least administrative capacity at the local government level, right? And partly, many of them will have volunteer elected officials. It's not their full-time job. It's like something they're elected to do, but they're working another job. They're going to have town halls that the staff are really focused on the services that they're meant to provide, so the water, sewer, public safety, emergency services. They might not have many staff that are about planning or about forward thinking, forward planning, forward economic development. A lot of them don't have economic development planners, actually, those local governments. And so we have to be able to say, you can use the money to kind of get yourself ready to then also do the kinds of things that might be really good for the future of the economic future of the community as well.
If I understand it correctly, that's kind of what Recompete does, right? It did a planning round.
Yes.
And then
And it's
evidently
very
next month
flexible
or
money.
so,
Yes.
the actual implementation money comes.
And the actual implementation money will be flexible and have flexibility for hiring staff as necessary or doing the coordination, community outreach that might be necessary to be able to then also take advantage of those economic plans that they're putting in place. Yeah, so it is revenue sharing up to a point. And I will say, that I think development theory and practice, and you really see this on the international development side, has very much been around investing locally and providing as much flexibility within certain parameters as possible. In fact, you can look at USAID, which is going to the way they're evaluating their programs, USAID, which makes our investments overseas, they have like a baseline of saying our interventions have to show better impact than cash-only programs, i.e., if we're giving cash only to people, we can see a certain level of impact in their lives off of the cash only. Our interventions, if we're going to actually invest in an intervention, that's a government grant program or something like that, we better be getting better results than if we were just giving cash only to people. And there's a movement even inside on their evaluation policies to be able to do that. And you can even look at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which again gives money directly to countries over a 5-year compact, and it's really the country that sets up the way in which they're going to manage that money and program that money within certain parameters. But it really is about investing in kind of the leadership and the ideas at the local level, and hopefully providing also the capacity for them to be successful with it.
I mean, we do see this in a number of federal programs where they've sort of tested kind of voucher type approaches alongside more centrally top-down approaches to look at relative outcomes. And again, these are scientifically controlled studies. The ones that have been done show like this effect of, if you kind of give people money without too many strings, they often do better than the people that you give the money and the strings to. And there was a homeless family program, Moving to Opportunity, which was a Bush administration program to help families move out of troubled neighborhoods. There have been a number of these things, and it seems like if we're trying that on the foreign side, we ought to maybe have a deliberate policy where we're at least testing alongside the more structured top-down approach, a more flexible bottom-up kind of approach, and like let the best approach win. It's rather than, just.
I think that's what you're seeing with Recompete and some other approaches as well. For sure.
Yeah. Well, I think we definitely need to follow this very closely. I had one more question about, in the book, he uses this very interesting expression that Casa Grande was kidded to death. Do you remember this? Kidded?
Kidded to death.
Yeah, like it wasn't just the problems within the community, but the way that that project related to the surrounding towns. What did Banfield mean when he said it was kidded to death?
Yeah, it's there were folks outside the community who joked about this being a Soviet experiment, a collectivist sort of thing, and well, just would jest at people on the cooperative when they would come into town. And that kind of, what Banfield found is that ate at the people's consciences, because they also viewed themselves as independent human beings who should be able to stand on their own feet. And so in some way, partaking in this government project put them in a spot where they were living contrary to their own values, and this outside kidding just surfaced that. And even though it wasn't exceeding or malicious, it wasn't like mobs of people taunting the settlers, it was just jabs being slipped in at the general store or something like that, and it bothered the people. It struck at their central identity as people who believed they should be able to support themselves.
And they were already outsiders in that community.
And they were outsiders
by
in that
nature, because
community.
they've come from all over the place. So,
Yeah, if I could just double back, you mentioned millennium. I think it's really interesting, the whole contrast between a community organizing or a country organizing and say, hey, we want to apply for this because we've got this thing that we need support for, that we believe in. It kind of helps the persons who are on the giving end, because the person on the giving end is always on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, they don't want to be control freaks. Some of them do, perhaps. That's what happened with the FSA, because they were like, if this thing fails, we're going to catch heck from the media and from Congress. But if we give the discretion over to you, like, you could screw it up. Well, this is a self-selection where people are coming forward saying, no, we've got something. And they are asking for you, as opposed to it being, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, let's do this thing. That's just a very different approach to aid. I don't know if it squares the circle, but it then gets into the issue that surfaced earlier, which is some communities are not going to be able to make that pitch. You run into federal grants a lot. When a new program gets created, the folks who can queue up are big cities, Los Angeles, Cleveland. I mean, they've got people on staff who are planners. They know how to do the federal paperwork. They get the system, and they can get through those hoops and hurdles. Whereas a smaller town, they don't have that person on staff. They end up having to outsource it to some sharp in a big city to fill out the paperwork for them. So,
and then they have to manage it once they get it, which is another
all the compliance stuff.
Yeah, it's really challenging. Okay, let's take some questions. We'll start with the in-person audience, and then we've got one or two that are coming in from outside. Yes, sir, right here. One moment. Let's get a mic and then identify yourself.
Sure, David Osgo. It's not clear to me if the gentleman that the FSA put in charge was part of the co-op or if he was an FSA employee. And if he was just an FSA employee, what does that say about his incentive structure versus the others? So, was he an employee or was he part of the co-op?
Yeah, that was, in theory, he should have been hired by the board of the co-op, and he should have been paid out of co-op funds. The FSA, because they were trying to help this thing not run a deficit, because running a deficit would look bad to the press and people in DC, they paid Mr. Fall the manager's salary. And so, yes, you're absolutely correct. He had an incentive to think a bit more about what the FSA wanted than what the community wanted. And that was a thing that turned off the people who lived there, because he wasn't listening to them as much as they wanted, because they were under the illusion that they were the bosses, when not so much.
Other questions? Over here. So tell us who you are and what your affiliation is.
What was it?
Who you are and what your affiliation is.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Kieran Subramanian. I am a research assistant at the R Street Institute. Firstly, thank you for having such a riveting discussion about this topic. So I wanted to touch back on sort of the anthropology point that was made earlier. And so we've seen in some instances of these kinds of co-op kind of egalitarian style communities working, especially when you talk about like Native Americans and indigenous peoples communities. So do you think that some of the failure of this had to do with a values question about, like, say, some of the values that these settlers might have prioritized versus values that other egalitarian societies might have prioritized that made them more successful than what happened here?
I mean, can I take a crack at this one? I mean, I think that this discussion about the kidding effect that we were talking about just a minute ago is an aspect of this of the anthropology, the culture that underlies. I mean, that idea of the individual standing alone that's like a stereotype of the West, right? And these people are all from the Southwest, and they would have deeply imbibed this idea of we pull ourselves up, we are self-sufficient, and then to be reminded by other people who look like them, who have similar values, saying, you're actually a communist on a commune. And just that ribbing is going at that anthropology of who we are as human beings.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things that creates trust is this shared sense of history and identity. Like, we are this people, we are this community. I mean, you go out to my home state of Ohio, you stop in Pennsylvania. It's remarkable how towns often create an identity out of like the home football team, the high school football team. Like, go to Pittsburgh, there is Steeler Nation. I'm actually a fan of the Steelers, and I can tell you that when I've been in various parts of this country, if I bump into somebody with a Steelers hat on, we have a basis for having a conversation, and we're just going back and forth, even though we're complete strangers. And so that ability to see each other as fellows, that was wholly lacking in Casa Grande. And I think when you bring up the indigenous communities, like, that's one thing they got going for them. They have an identity, they have a history. And that's part of making your way through life, is having a larger story to tell of where you came from and where you're going.
So I really agree with that. As someone who grew up rooting for the Eagles, though I'm not part of Steeler Nation and would be oppositionally opposed on the other side of the state. But I would also posit that in this particular example, like, the primary incentive for these folks coming together was economic, right? Without much thought given to helping them create what that common vision could even look like. I mean, it was kind of imposed, or even not even, it was suggested that they would be a part of maybe creating something, but then a lot of that creation was actually not offered to them. I mean, it was imposed on them. And so I think that was very difficult for them to even come up with a group identity. Like, who were they as a group? What was their shared culture as a group? It was really like, oh, we're all just coming to farm. And to Brent's point, some of them probably had pretty deeply held beliefs around being individually self-sufficient, which, again, that could have worked if you maybe given time and the group itself had come together to be able to develop what their own value system and their own culture and their own group identity was. But I don't think you had that here. I do think that that's what's interesting actually about many places in rural America, is that you do have that deeply in places in rural America, even if they're places that have fallen on economic hard times. And I do think part of that kinship that we were talking about earlier comes from that group identity, comes from that communities have identity. We talk a lot about identity, and we talk a lot about identity politics these days, and we're always usually talking about it as an individual. But communities have identities. They have shared histories. They have an identity of what they meant to the towns around them, to even the country. I come from anthracite coal country. We powered the country, and you will talk to people there, and they will say that. They don't do it anymore. Anthracite coal went out of business, or went out of style really when I was born, frankly, a long, long time ago. It's a special kind of coal that the market didn't really bear very well. And so that those places then have to remake their identities or see what the future of their place is going to be, but they don't leave that history behind as well.
Just to expand on that a little bit, it's like, so identity is so important to making communities work. It is also, it can be a real barrier in terms of trying to assist communities who have, this is a boundary. This is what we call, a social or cultural boundary around a community that can make it very difficult to help. And somehow, and I think you cover this well in your podcast, Tony, of like it's this very delicate kind of dance between inside and outside, the inside community resource and the outside resources that are coming in. It has to blend in a way, and it really requires, it requires kind of an artisan approach to public policy, right? It's not something that you can fashion at a high level. It's got to be people on the ground who have that gift for pulling the community together around goals. Okay, yep, let's go over here.
Hi, Jeff Cavaservice from the Niskanen Center. Thanks very much, Tony, Kevin, Brent. Great discussion. I am familiar with the temptation of C-SPAN listeners to lob the kind of question missile that has multiple independent warheads at you. It's so interesting. But let me just go with this. We've seen in countries like Germany, Great Britain, an attempt to do a government program of leveling out some of the structural inequalities between regions. It's called Leveling Up in Britain. It's the Strukturwandel in Germany, aimed at the coal countries. If the United States were to undertake such a program, what do you think Banfield would tell you that you need to think about before you do such a thing?
I would think the first thing he would say is, are you sure that your idea of what is leveling up is the same idea of the people you're trying to help? Is your idea of the shared good the same as theirs? And he was a guy who regularly did battle with people when they would invoke the common good, because he was a pluralist. He said, society's got so many diverse folks that, the idea of the common good is a pretty complicated one, and it's an anthropological one. You've got to investigate and you got to ask questions. So I think that'd be the first thing. I think the second thing he would say is, don't be surprised if the administration of anything you do ends up going haywire and ends up benefiting insiders, and that you suffer what Arthur Ocon called the leaky bucket problem. You may start with a bucket of money this big, but by the time it gets to the beneficiaries, so much of it is leaked out. And the last thing would be he would remind you that reality is just not stable. The inherent dynamism of capitalism is bound to disrupt your efforts to create any sort of leveling. Things may work for a time. You may shrink the gap between regions, but don't be surprised if they open up again, because different people tend to have different abilities and different prospects for generating wealth.
I would just add to that to say that it's not just that capitalism is dynamic, it's that human beings in the communities they live in are dynamic. The economy is just an expression of human social behavior, and that changes over time. And you can't script it. So I think that that's like one. Obviously, Casa Grande is an extreme form of scripting, right? It's probably one of the most extreme forms that you could imagine. And there are greater and lesser degrees of that. For some kinds of projects, it's not just that we want people employed in the chip industry, right, in semiconductors. It's that we have a national security issue here that we're trying to solve, that we're using to leverage economic development, and that, you know, that national security issue is with us. It's not going away. Anyway, it's just a very complicated, the further you descend down toward the local level, the more complex these matters are. And so that gets back to our knowledge problem. You know, do we actually have the information that we need in order, at the federal level, to effectively seed economic development programs? And if we don't, if we think that we might not, then don't we need kind of a variety of approaches to figure out what will work best? That's kind of where I come back to in this discussion, is like, I'm not saying don't do Recompete or don't do Chips and Science or don't do tech hubs or don't do any of the other programs. I'm saying if you're going to do them, let's make sure that we're trying sort of a diverse set of approaches so that we can measure which one of those kinds of approaches is most helpful.
I would offer a few other thoughts. So one, we've been talking about sort of the dynamism of capitalism and how that will change the best laid plans. I think we have to be very careful to also understand, and Kevin, you even said this, that policy or planning occurs in the context of politics. So it's not just capitalism that's dynamic, so is policy. And
And so is politics.
Yeah, and so is politics. So I was in, North Carolina working in philanthropy at a time when we lost our furniture manufacturing industry in real time, our textile mills in real time, and broadleaf agriculture or broadleaf tobacco agriculture basically went to large agribusiness, and that had significant impacts on a lot of communities. Well, all of those things were really related to policy decisions in intersection with markets. And so on one hand, there was policy decisions made that changed the economic playing field. There weren't very many policy decisions that took into account what the implications would be on particular places. So I think in terms of leveling up, one, we need to be thinking in terms of, not just what will happen with people, but what will happen with places. So that would be one thing I would posit. I think what Banfield would say also is local development happens because local people lead it and own it. And for them to do that well, they are going to need to have a kind of cooperation that really is set up to them. So I would say, if we are going to invest, and we need investment for economic or community development to happen at a local level, we ought to be in a backseat. Local people ought to be driving that. But we also need to be investing in the local governance structures to ensure that those can be shared as widely as possible and include the people to get as close as possible to having the cooperation that's necessary for that to occur. And what we often do is we invest in the thing, we invest in the widget, rather than investing in the processes and in the governance and in the capacity. And I think that's where we need to be flexible and we need to be real, because to your point, Brent, things are dynamic and are going to change. So if you don't have those trusted governance processes actually happening, it's not going to be successful, or not be as successful as it ought to be.
Kevin?
I was just going to say, you're so right. Banfield, by virtue of reading deep in sociology and being very attuned to local differences and value structures and all that, he would absolutely agree. The human capital is so important. I mean, whether we're talking about you're trying to build a high-tech factory somewhere, well, what percentage of the workforce is actually able to be there because they're sober? They're not in the grips of addiction. That's a basic question. Banfield, interestingly, not long after Government Project, wrote a book called The Moral Basis of a Backward Society. And he and his wife went to rural Italy, and they examined this community that was just stuck in poverty. And what he ultimately found was that the locals' individuals' value structure were all about family. Your family was your tribe, you had to focus on it, and anyone outside that tribe, don't trust them. So local government couldn't do anything. Businesses had a hard time forming because people, well, I can't trust if this guy's actually going to pay me, he may be a crook. Inability to set up any sort of banking. I'm not going to lend you money. How do I know you'll ever pay it back? That inability to trust beyond your immediate family just left it in a crippling state, which was in a real severe contrast to his on-the-ground explorations of Mormon communities out in Utah. He wrote a manuscript that was never published about communities out there, and it was just amazing to him that despite the desperate conditions, despite the fact that they were held in contempt by a lot of non-Mormons, nonetheless, these people could cooperate. They had the glue, they had the shared history, the shared vision for the future, and the levels of trust, and just the belief in being industrious that helped them power through and do remarkable things.
So on the Italy issue, the internet meme about, men are always thinking about Rome. You think they're thinking about something else, they're just thinking about Rome. It's hard not to think about Rome, and this is an interesting aspect because I was just reading a book on this, and they talked about how in ancient Rome, in the way that communities were developed and came together, families were the single most important unit. It was not neighborhoods. It was not the community itself. It's where ancestor worship came from. Like the family is the thing, right? So that's got a very long tail on it, evidently, because if they're still struggling with that in the mid-20th century, then we have to pay attention to those things. These are very durable beliefs, values, and behaviors that have to be integrated into economic development. Enough about Rome. Okay, we have any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Leo Plummer, Mercatus Center. So it seems to me that you can sort of separate the failure there are three components in which Casa Grande kind of failed. And one of which is the knowledge problem, which you talked about. The other is the incentive structure, the setup. And then you also had just recently a long discussion about the culture, the interpersonal squabbles, et cetera. And they failed on all of these three things. So if any one of those had been different, if it had been designed better, or if they had already had a sense of community or shared bonds or mutual trust in the community, would that have been, this is kind of speculation, but counterfactually, would it have turned out better, or do you need all three of those things to be kind of aligned to have this kind of project work?
Well, I think what they were attempting was an inherently risky economic enterprise. I mean, there were mega farms that were already cropping up, and those farms were only just going to get bigger and bigger. So the idea that they could compete with the private sector, that in itself is maybe. Well, maybe. I like to say that the project could have succeeded if they had simply given up the idea of it being cooperative and instead run it like the Army. If you're signing up to join the Army, this is not a democracy. You do not get a vote. Your feelings don't mean anything. Your job is to obey and to produce to the maximum, and then to reap the benefits thereof, which would be the free housing, the health care, the food, all that sort of thing. If they had run that farm in that way and people had been selected fully realizing, you wouldn't have had factional politics breaking the place apart, because it simply there wouldn't have been a place for politics to occur. If you had decided that, well, we're not going to make this be a self-sustaining enterprise, this is going to be a component of a larger governmental entity, and if they don't make a profit one year, if they run a little bit of loss, we don't have to worry about cutting their pay. Yeah, you could have kept this thing up and running a bit longer. But ultimately, over the long run, they were making a big bet on a sector of the society that was going to go through some fantastic dynamism thanks to technological changes and economic shifts. So,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would agree that if you run it like the Army, it would have succeeded, because I think there would have been politics at the very top, and so I'm not sure how that would have played out. I will say that in terms of lessons from the podcast, and so when I visit towns, I've got a selection bias. I'm looking for towns where, things are going well. There's some progress being made, and what I find there is a sense of civic collaboration. So there, you can. It takes the whole gamut. It can be an informal group of farmers that are just making decisions together, or it can be something formal, like it can be a new business association cooperating with a new faith-based association, and they're putting plans in place that's moving the town forward. But that sense of civic cooperation and collaboration is really important, and it is actually about a different vision for the town itself. Like, people have bought into it. There's a lot of ways in which they get there, and there's leadership that's underneath all of that. But there is a sense of hope and of we can move forward together, and there's some collaboration, whether it's official governance or non-official. And so I think that mirrors some of the ways in which you just broke down into those three different parts. I don't know if they all have to be there, and you can't manufacture a lot of it from the outside, which is the tricky part. But to Kevin's point, if you've got a program set up and people are coming to you with their vision that they've already worked out and asking for investment, then I think you've got a better chance of it succeeding.
Okay, well, this is really, oh, we have one more question? Is that right?
Mine is more like I'm used to be a high school teacher from India, so this might be of a little bit of value from outside the system that we're talking within the United States. And now, as an immigrant, we are supposed to be the latest immigrant addition to this country collection. So, but it's been about 30 years, and I used to go home pretty much all the time, meaning within like once in 2 years at least. So on that basis, we are a refugee settlement in India. And I myself, being a coward, it kind of pays off to understand the dynamism and also not get into trouble and then be gotten rid of. So again, I'm hoping that you are my president here, President Biden, and all the highermost levels of, the world leaders who will represent us and our thoughts. So I'm going to present this, even though I'm nobody, but at the same time I have the opportunity. Now this Casa Grande is the poorest population, and yes, my parents also started with scratch, because they had to flee the Cultural Revolution in the 1950s from Tibet. Now there seem to be like different secret societies involved, different, all these world players, like the way they are world players in my country, as I found out.
Okay, can you move to a question?
Yes, sir. So how can we educate the younger ones that are kind of, like there are many to point out, but my kind of, as an ordinary person, my worries is like very basic stuff. I'm not want to be in politics. I don't want to play anything. I just want to live a very fruitful and dignified life. Therefore, the kids and all these, if they do not know their background, all this kidding thing, the animal husbandry thing, that they are like really kind of either using or found out they're getting rid of them pretty much.
I'm not sure that we have an answer for how to instill that.
But please help us, like as educational, academicians on the ground level and the community activism and all that stuff, so that we can kind of keep the population, the younger ones, so that they will have a fair chance of what is going on in the world, rather than being used till they die.
We will do our best on that. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for coming. We do have a little reception when we're done here, if you want to join us, continue the conversation. It's been great, such great questions from you all. Kevin, thank you for coming into town specifically to do this with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.